Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Women in Math and STEM, where our mission is to reach out to as many professionals, aspiring professionals, students, whatever you name it. We try to reach out to them, who essentially support the initiative of bringing more women and young girls into the STEM field. So, with that being said, as always, feel free to open up the description or transcript to better follow along, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hello, and thank you so much for coming today and talking with me. Just to sort of start off, do you mind introducing yourself and sort of walking us through your journey in math education and sort of where you are today and how you got there?
Sure. I am Tisha Jones, and oh my goodness, where to start? I currently work in curriculum development. I work for an organization. We publish a math pre-K through 5 curriculum, and my focus is assessment, which I am very excited about. But prior to that, well, if I go way back, I got my degree from Florida A&M in elementary education. And I then moved to Atlanta, where I currently live, and I started teaching. And I taught everything from like kindergarten through a pre-algebra class 1 year. And my focus over time really became teaching like how do we improve elementary math instruction. And that really started when I was teaching in a district here in Atlanta where there was this professional development opportunity between my district and Georgia Tech, and it was focused on math and science. And that was the first time through that professional development that I got to see all of the different ways that kids can think about math. And it was the first time I saw math as this kind of more creative thing that can be just so engaging and fun. I mean, I personally enjoyed it. I grew up, my mom was a math teacher, so like math has been a part of my life forever and ever. But it was not, as a kid, it wasn't my favorite thing. But so my mom and I both kind of imagined, because I was for sure more into like reading and writing, that that would be the thing that I loved in school. And once I got into this professional development, it was like this light bulb went off. And I was just so excited about what I was learning, and I wanted to like really kind of see like, do kids do this? Like, is this, does this really happen? Where is this coming from? Like all of these different like problem solving strategies and things like that. It was so fascinating, and it was very cool to move away from this idea that kids had to do things in one way for it to be correct. And so from there, it just like that just kind of launched me into, continuing to learn and working with kids in a way that I had not been working with them before that. But this was really early in my career.
I see, makes sense. I think you mentioned how sort of your perspective on math education is that kids don't have to always do things in a certain way. I was just wondering sort of what events or what in particular inspired you to have such a viewpoint and sort of like how that viewpoint has changed with time.
Mean, change with time. I would say it probably has only like deepened over time. Um, I think that I think about how I learned math, and it was very algorithmic. So, you learn the standard algorithm or the traditional algorithm for adding, you learn the traditional algorithm for subtracting. So those steps that we all remember where, you're carrying or you're borrowing or whatever, multiplication, division. And what I realized in the beginning through this professional development was that there's you can do all of those things and not really understand what's happening with the numbers. And so like one of the examples that I can think about, so I didn't mention this before, but I had an opportunity to actually teach some math methods classes at the university level. And so I was working with some undergraduates, and like I would ask them about like the standard algorithm for multiplication and like what, when you carry this, what does that mean? What does that tell? Like, how much even is that? And especially like if you think about you're doing like a double digit times a double digit number, and when you carry that first number, that makes sense, right? Everybody like, okay, that's what that is. But when you carry that second number and it's over that tens place, it may not be the value that you are imagining, because there's a lot, because these are efficient methods for doing computation, but they're not necessarily the most evident in like the values and what's happening inside of, why do these things work? And so what happens is it almost starts to feel a little bit like you're doing this magic trick, right? Like you're doing these things with these numbers and voila, there's an answer at the end. But the problem with that is that it's hard to find, if you've made a calculation error, if you don't really understand what's going on, but you've done all the steps, it might be harder to find where your error is. Or it might be harder to even notice that there was an error in the beginning, right? Like, so that's all that number sense piece. And so the more that we play around with numbers and we break them apart and we put them together and we try them this way and that way, we're building this number sense so that we have a better understanding of what should happen at the end. And so for me, over time, I have just seen that that's so incredibly important, because when you don't have any other tools, what do you do when you don't know what to do, right? You only have one tool. Well, we don't really want to do a job where we only have one tool. And the standard algorithm is like having just one tool. And the other thing that I think has been really incredible about opening it up a little bit is it gives more kids an opportunity to show their brilliance, right? Like, so what happens for those kids that the standard algorithm is just not the way that it makes the most sense for them, but they can do it this way or they can do it that way, right? Well, why do we limit that? Like, we want to make sure that those ideas from kids are honored and that there's value in the ways that they're thinking about the computation, because that's what's efficient to them.
I see. I was also just wondering about sort of how you deal with like anxiety and frustration with your students, and are there any sort of innovative methods you've created or stumbled across that work particularly well?
Well, the first thing that I will say is it just takes time, right? Like, um, we're not going to we're not going to help a kid get beyond anxiety or a lack of confidence immediately. Um, and I think that the one of the biggest ways that I have tried to support students is to help them know what they know, right? It's hard to be confident about your ability in something if you feel like you don't know anything. And so, one of the things that I would always do for kids, one of my favorite things was when they would come to me and they would say, "Is this right?" And I would look at them and I would say, I don't know, is it? And of course, they're waiting for me to tell them what, and they're like, and so I'm like, well, how do you know if it's right? And so they go through, and what's really cool about having them explain what they did in that moment is if they made an error, a lot of times they'll catch it on their own and they'll be like, oh, and so it never came from me. It always comes from them. But there's also no shame in it, right? Like, so it's like, oh, there's an error. I know what to do. I'm going to go fix it. I caught that, right? So there's no shame. There's no frustration. It's like, oh, I can go fix this. And then two, if they get to the end and they've told me all the things, and I say, along the way, is that Are you sure that that's correct? And they'll say yes. And then we'll go to the next thing and they're like, so are you sure that's correct? Like, are you very sure? Are you positive that you did that correctly? Yes. And so by the time we get to the end, I'm like, so is there anything that I could tell you now that would tell you that this is wrong? And they'll be like, no. And now it's something they own. It's not something that I own for them. Another thing that I would do, because sometimes it's hard for kids to know how to get started on a problem, and they'll sit there and they'll be stuck. And I will go to them and I would say, well, tell me what you know. And without fail, I'll have that one student that's like, nothing. And I'm like, you know nothing? And they're like, nope, I don't know anything. And so then so then I'll say, well, do you know that? And they'll say, well, yeah. And I'll say, okay, well, what about that? Do you know that? And they'll say, well, yeah. And I'm like, so you don't know nothing. So some of it is just kind of sending this new message that there are things that you know. And so you can start from this place of what you do know, and we can work from there. But starting from nothing is a hard place to start from, right? Where do we go from there? So it really is trying to kind of help them start to own some of the things that they know, and own their answers and own their strategies, and continuing to build them up in that way. And I have seen that. I mean, in one school year, I don't know that I've like, for a kid who's had a lot of math anxiety, I don't know that I've completely turned it around, but I've absolutely seen a lot of progress in kids who are feeling more apprehensive about sharing.
And then sort of on a similar note, I was also curious about any challenges you've faced while like sort of in your career of math education and how you sort of overcame those challenges.
Mm. Um, I mean, there have been a lot of challenges. Um, I think that so one of the biggest challenges were the times, like the places where I worked at, schools where we had no curriculum. And I don't necessarily think that, like I clearly believe in curriculum. That's what I do now, but I also don't think that, it's like a script, but it does help organize when you're planning everything from scratch and you're trying to figure out what order and you're trying to figure out what lesson, and you're doing all of these things. That is a lot of work. And so it's not that it's impossible. It's just it's a significant amount of work. And I guess as far as overcoming it, I mean, you just do it. I didn't really have much of a choice. But what I did do was I found resources that I believed in, and I would build around some of those resources. And the resources that I really liked were the ones that provided more rich thinking. Like I really tried to not like find those things that were like worksheet based or whatever, but like resources that gave me good problems, good types of tasks and activities. And and then I also found math people. So through social media, I started really kind of connecting with like following different math people that I felt like also really believed in this kind of richer math thinking and tasks for kids. And we're not like, trying to push algorithms and those kinds of things. I'm not saying that procedures are not important. They are absolutely important. They help us to be more efficient. So I don't mean it in that way, but I found the people that I think were kind of having the conversations that I was thinking about in my head, and I would follow them and like kind of see what things they were talking about, what resources, what ideas. And that was kind of how I began to build what I was going to be doing in my classroom. And of course, using whatever standards or things that were set out by the school that I needed to make sure that we were, that also helped to inform how I put things together.
Sounds good. I was also just curious about, since I think you mentioned in one of your in a TED talk that math isn't just about numbers, it's also about thinking. I was wondering, since that's such a unique perspective, what it sort of means to you, to like your students or students who are interested in math, like math educators, professionals, honestly just anybody.
So for me, like when I think about the one of the major values in math, it's not just the ability to crank out numbers, but it's really in that problem solving. And problem solving to me is a life skill. Like we all have a problem. And if we think about a real problem, right? And I don't mean like your world's crumbling down kind of a problem, but like just something that's like an obstacle or a challenge or whatever. Like you're not really sure how to get to the solution. That's what a real problem is. When you start, you're facing some problem and you don't really have a path that's laid out for you to an answer, right? Or to some solution. So it's like, okay, I've got to start somewhere. So I'm looking at this problem and where do I start? I don't know where to start, but I should do something. And then maybe I find that as I get going, it's kind of leading me in the wrong direction or it's not quite right. Well, at that point, what a lot of kids want to do when they're doing their own work is they want to ball up their paper or erase everything and they want to throw it all away. But what I think we have the opportunity to do in math is say, whoa, 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 whoa. There's value in what you've done, right? Like we can learn from, like you now know more than when you started. So how can we look at this and say, and use this to inform our next thing that we're going to do, right? And we want to, that helps us as problem solvers, right? We shouldn't just say throw everything away. We want to keep moving forward. We want to use what we've already done to build on and inform our next choices. And that's what we want students to learn. And I think math provides that opportunity to help students learn that skill of like, let's look at what you did. What do you know now that you didn't know before? And how can you use what you've done to decide on what you're going to do next? And when we give them rich problems where they're kind of more, they're less laid out for them, those kinds of problems give them those kinds of opportunities to do that problem solving.
Sounds good. And just to sort of end off, I was wondering if you had any piece of advice, recommendations, suggestions, honestly anything for students, but particularly young students who are sort of like trying to find their way in the world and trying to find what they like, and like sort of just what they should do, what like kind of mindset they should have, etc.
Oh, that's such a great question. I would say that even if you don't feel it in the moment, you are better at math than you give yourself credit for. Um, I would say that the way that you think about math has value. No matter what anybody tells you, the way that you approach math, like there's value there in how you solve problems and how you do computation. Even if it doesn't match exactly with what you're learning or what you're being asked to do, like just don't quit on math. It really is um it's important. And even if you can't see it like in your life, the one thing that I've told my own children and I've told other people like my students is, this idea of we'll never use this. At any age, you have no idea the things that you will use or you won't. And so the more that you can keep developing your math understanding, the more opportunities that you are leaving open for yourself in the future. And maybe you don't choose to go this way or that way, but having that choice is the best part, right? Like, but when you say, I don't like this, I'm not going to do it, it doesn't matter. When those things become a part of how you think about math, you're now cutting off a whole bunch of opportunities from yourself. So stick with it and just think about it as trying to keep open as many opportunities for yourself as you possibly can as you go through school.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for coming today and speaking with me. It was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you.
Oh, you've been great. Thank you so much for having me.